Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Equity in the Center LinkedIn Live. Today, I'm Tanaja Jordan. I'm a comm specialist working with Equity in the Center, and I'm really excited for today's conversation about the Race Equity Pulse Check and how one nonprofit is sharing their experience with using the Racial Equity Pulse Check to advance racial equity in their organization. And for those who are not that familiar with the Racial Equity Pulse Check, the Race Equity Cycle Pulse Check is a tool used to help teams assess where they are on the path to building racial equity um, and help identify opportunities to continue making tangible progress towards equity. Some of you may recall that the Race Equity Cycle Pulse Check is rooted in Equity in the Center's Awake to Woke to Work framework. And provides a structured approach for organizations to identify gaps, set goals, and track progress toward building a race equity culture. So now, I don't like to, butcher people's introductions or their names. So I usually invite people to introduce themselves whenever I do a LinkedIn Live. I'm going to mute myself when I'm not talking because there are a lot of us today. And so my first question to all of you is please introduce yourself to us. And then also tell us how you are doing right now. How are you holding up in the current times?
Great. I think we all will look to one another to see who will go first. And so I'll just go ahead and get us started. I'm Debbie Barnes, and how am I doing today? I really lean into one of our practices. It's around looking at trauma informed, but also looking at it from a healing centered engagement. And so, although there's many things around us that kind of adds to those ACEs scores that go up, there's also many things in my life that allows it to have the lens of a healing centered engagement. So, with all that said, I'm having a great day and glad to be here. And so, with that, why don't I hand off to Fuzi?
Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. Fuzi Bilal, and I am a member of the ARC board, and I'm happy to be here, privileged to be in this space with you. And how am I doing today? I'm always good when I'm with Debbie and Jackie because the conversation is always great, and I'm excited to be here and be part of this conversation. Thank you for the opportunity.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jackie Heinga Hilseth, and I'm the CEO of Associated Recreation Council. It's my privilege to be here with two of my colleagues, one from the board and one of my training managers. I would say right now it's been challenging sitting in a leadership position for multiple reasons. I think there's just a new environment that we're living in that at times increases and creates some challenges around just centering ourselves in our commitment to equity and staying in the work together. But the real joy of the work is I have like-minded colleagues who keep me grounded, who support, who have vision, who reach out and work in community. And that's the part that fills my cup and keeps me going, is knowing that there's an extended team of support that's working together. For me personally, I'm a traditional weaver of the Tsimshian Nation, and I funnel my balance through my practice of weaving. So as long as I have those things going in my life, I feel centered, good, and can get up and continue this work in a leadership role.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, everybody. I'll just share briefly that I'm feeling really good right now. These are the kinds of engagements and conversations that galvanize me. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while now, and so it's wonderful to see it come to fruition. And the thing that continues to sustain me, as somebody who lives in New York and has family in Chicago and loved ones in Portland, Seattle, all over, I think what's helpful to me is sort of I stay in good artistic practice as a writer. I'm always writing, and getting these experiences down. I think that it is the work of cultural workers specifically to preserve what we're going through in this time. And I feel galvanized by that, to meet the moment to, preserve some of this history. So let's get really into it. So we're here obviously talking about organizations, Associated Recreation Council's race equity journey. And so I guess the first place to start is at the beginning. How did you all begin your race equity journey, and what were some of the pivotal moments?
I think I'll lean into just kind of framing us as an
Mhm.
organization. One of the things that I like to build on is looking at our vision. And when I think about our vision, which says bringing together all people to build healthy communities, there's a key word that I like to lean into, and the word is all. And so it's really around serving the communities of Seattle, and how do we create inclusion where all feel that they belong and that services are there for them. When I think about our mission, it says inspire engagement and participation in equitable, dynamic, culturally relevant, and responsive recreation, childcare, and lifelong learning. So there again, there's some key words that becomes our foundation, those building blocks of building the bedrock in which we put our framework in. The other piece that I'd like to lean into is we do have 6 organizational values, and I'd like to share those with you as well. The first one is equitable access. That means how do we even connect to one another? Community engagement and participation. It doesn't say some communities, but community engagement. The other piece is around mutual respect. That means we all don't need to be alike, but how do we have respect and inclusion for everyone to be in community? And the next one is really around community. And so in building community, it's how do we foster environment for all to belong? And then how are we accountable, which is our other value. So it can't be what we say, but how are we accountable for that? And then the last one that I want to share is we've actually verbally and put out that we have a commitment to race and social justice. So how do we live into that? And so just our foundational documents begin to set the tone of who we are and why we do this work. I want to hand off to Jackie at this time because there's another piece within our board foundation that really solidifies our movement in this work. Jackie.
Yeah, thanks, Debbie. Those are really powerful statements to have within our org. And the challenge for me, I started in 2020, right as the pandemic was taking place. In fact, the second day, I think, was when our governor shut down our state and everybody went remote. But coming into this kind of interesting space, for me, what was important is how do we start to create a system that supports our race equity work? So no matter who is in leadership, no matter who comes and goes, what is that foundational systemic action that can help sustain us over time? And when I came in, our board of directors was actively working on changing a section in our bylaws, which actually called for ARC to have an equity audit on an annual basis. They also changed the membership officer roles. So they went from just having a board president and vice president to having 2 vice presidents and a board chair. And one of the vice president's roles was to ensure that the equity audit took place on an annual basis. Now it got codified in the bylaws in 2021. So to me, that was a very strong decision that a board was able to take for an organization who already had a commitment. It just strengthened what would be happening in our future. We are required to do an audit. We're required to stop and look at our practices. So that to me was a huge systemic decision that really we were able to build upon. Now, we also, coming in 2020, I was very familiar with really 3 frameworks, including the equity in the centers. Awake to Work was really being looked at that time actively in the nonprofit community. Pro-Inspire was a place we looked at that had a lot of tools to really strengthen the individual's experience. And then, of course, Annie Casey Foundation, 7 Key Steps for Moving Towards a Systemic Model in an org was being looked at. And then we were, prior to the pulse check, we were looking at equity in the center and really resonated with the levels of change that could occur. So for us, I'll just step back and say we knew that on a personal basis, we needed to work with our leadership staff and our board. So we went through a lot of trainings that were aligned to individual work. And then we had to step back and start looking at, okay, how are we going to assess what's happening in the org? What are those foundational things that need to put in place? We worked on an orientation. We worked on a glossary, so shared language was part of what this organization would lean into. We also worked on ensuring that we had a trajectory that would welcome anyone where they were on their journey to start this process. And so we did spend time to be very intentional about putting some of these systems in place. But one of the most powerful things we did early days 2021 is our leadership staff paired up, and we tried to pair with a white staff and a BIPOC staff. And they did co-presentations about their own race equity journey as an individual. And for me, that was at a time when we were all virtual, that was one kind of human thing that brought us really close to understanding where we come from, what our journey's been. And having the co-presentation, they had to lean on each other and kind of challenge each other's differences and really lean into this space of understanding. That to me was, for the leadership team, a pivotal point where we really started building trust. So I'll pause there and see from the board's perspective if Fuzi wants to lean into a little bit more from that lens.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jackie. When I first met Jackie was in a conversation about in a board recruitment conversation, and what was really appealing for me, as I am very passionate about this work, is the opportunity to address this at a structural level. And I think Jackie's team with having specific bylaws that holds the organization accountable in the implementation of a race equity lens and everything that we do was very appealing. And so when Jackie said, well, this is part of our bylaws and this is what we do and it's part of our fabric, and there's no way we're going to get rid of this work, and it's never going to default into like it's not a popular topic right now, or so it's part of who we are and we'll continue to do this work. So that was very appealing. And then the other aspect of it is when Jackie shared, and I'm sure she'll share this a little bit later, of what that looks like in practice in terms of access and all the values that Debbie shared earlier. So I was very excited about this process. I came in a little bit later, so this is my going into 2.5 years with the organization, and we have gone through from a board's perspective is to really get an understanding of what this equity audit looks like for us as from an oversight board, and what can we do to move together to support the work that ARC is doing. And one of the tools that we leaned into is to do an assessment and see where we are as a board through this process that was shared with the board, and then also embark in a development plan. And that development plan or progression plan for us to continue to learn as a board and anchor our decisions from a racial equity lens was to we picked 2 priorities this time. One is to engage our broader constituents in our broader community, which is our advisory counselor. So every community center in our that we serve has a leadership group. So how do we engage that leadership group so they can actually embrace this and help us disseminate this information and our shared language and our work into the community. So we're working with advisory council to provide a discussion around this and be a support system for them. And how many advisory councils do we have? I think, Debbie, we have what?
There's 36.
36 of them. So there's 36 different. So we figured that's a way for us to make a bigger impact. Internally, we are very deliberate about allocating time in board meetings to really reflect on what this looks like for us to anchor us. So we've embarked in a journey to do an education session, whether it's a self-reflection or a portion of a book that we can assess that can kick us off and get us started in every board meeting, and then have that as an anchor for our work. And I'll pause there and pass it on.
Thank you so much for these really inspiring answers. Before we go into the next question, I just want to lift up. So it seems like there was there was alignment, like at the leadership level of the organization, in yourself, Jackie, and in the values that you have, like already, that there's in the bylaws a racial equity and social justice commitment. I think that that's something that like a lot of people may not already experience. Some leaders might be trying to figure out, how do I get to that place where we have at least like those commitments in our bylaws or like openly discussed. And it seems like there was too with you, Fuzi, there was already a culture on the board of, yes, we do this. Yes, this is important to us. Has it always been like that at ARC? Or was that itself getting to that place of having it in the bylaws and having the board, be generally accepting of this importance, and having that phenomenal alignment between the board and the leader? Was it always like that, or was getting to that place a process too?
I think I know Debbie has a few more years ahead of me as being part of the organization, but how I would frame this is, when I came into the Associated Recreation Council, it was still very much a mainstream organization and nonprofit. We do work in service of Seattle Parks and Recreation. So we are in community. They've always served community. And I think the vision, mission, and values were able to describe the commitment from the organization. But when I came in, I think there was not a intentional system. There weren't intentional systems in place that really could keep these words that were so powerful moving forward and organized in a way to where not just staff understood and were educated, but that we could reach the community and start modeling what it is we mean by these words that are so powerful in our statements. So to me, I would say we were in very early phases of understanding what it meant to scale this. And we had key members on the board at that time that were race equity consultants that understood what they were doing by putting this in the bylaws was something we would have to really respond to. So I do think there were two things going on as I came in. There was some really knowledgeable folks on the board that made a commitment. I would not say everybody was on board in the same way that you would assume they would be on board with this, but because of the mutual respect that is really part of this organization, dialogue could happen, and the board ultimately passed putting this bylaw forward. Culturally, I could only speak to my tenure. There was a lot of work to be done in education. There was a lot of work to be done with the staff to really let them know what this is and how it looks in day-to-day practice. Education, training, putting some things in place that will stand as our guiding practices. And we used a lot of I would say Debbie's team we created a logic model first to really embed, okay, what are those steps over time that will help move this work and educate folks on what it is? Because if we're not actively making this part of your day-to-day job, it just could be words that sit in a document that we all aspire to and turn to on an annual basis. By actually changing the system and engaging folks in the dialogue, in the education, in giving them an opportunity to hear from folks that have different experiences from themselves. But for me, it was making time for the staff who are very busy and do a lot of work in the community, so are constantly moving, supporting childcare, supporting recreation. How do we center and pivot the practice so this will be something we want them to learn about? We want them to understand, if you're going to work for this organization, this is the journey that we want you to commit to. You don't all have to be at the same place. We just need you to know that this is our value, this is our journey. We want to meet you where you are, and we want to support you to grow throughout this process, so that, as Debbie said in the beginning, that we're really reaching all people. And it's challenging to keep that cadence in place, but I think making it intentional in this pulse check has been key in us looking at a tangible assessment that is giving us data and information that we then take and prioritize. Okay, what actions can we take in the next 1 to 3 years? What actions are aspirational, 5 to 7? And then what are those long-term, 7+ years that we really want to lead this organization with, so that no matter what leadership comes in, this is just part of the Associated Recreation Council's journey. This is what we do. This is the culture we have. This is how we want you to lean into your service if you're part of our team. So I think what would be interesting for me is to hear maybe a little bit from Debbie, because she had been working at the org prior to me joining, and I think she's had some perspectives that are a little different than mine.
Thank you, Jackie. I was just thinking as you were saying that it was almost a culmination. So prior to Jackie's arrival, there was a RSJ committee, and it was a committee of staff, and the staff really wanting to ensure that it was part of our culture, how we serve one another. We know when we look at a framework from a structural to institutional to the individual, if we start with the individual, we really don't lean into the structural components of the work. And so, although there was good effort and good energy to look at it and to see how we could connect, even with our city of Seattle, it was coming from the individual basis. When we hit into the 20s and the 21s, we really seen that we needed to go into the structure. How do we build it from a structural component to have the systemic changes so that we could deal with how it's being institutionalized? And then we move into that individual cadence of work. So good work, and to really start and really framing it and really having culture change, we had to make some shifts in the way that we do our work. The other piece I would like to mention is this organization is 50 years old this year.
Mhm.
With that said, it has gone through its own evolutions just in services provided, how it's grown. It started with a few employees, and then it was growing, and our services began to grow. And so we got to the point where, yes, we need to look at how do we bring this vision of all, how do we bring this mission, how do we bring this values? And we just began by engaging in those conversations. I haven't been here 50 years, just to be clear on that. But with that, it all led up to each part bringing us another step to the work that we need to do. And I know many times when you're on that bottom step, it becomes discouraging. What do I do? Where do I turn to? I don't even know these words you're talking about. What is structural and institutional and individual? What is biases? What are all of these different words that we use at the table? And so just getting familiar to be comfortable and engaging these words and then leaning back. Now, organizationally, what do we do to have the systemic changes so that when we get to the individual part, it's really about moving into a cultural change supported by the structures and the institutions within the organization.
I thought that was absolutely amazing, and thank you so much for sharing and giving me that added lens to think about. That sort of, there's a parallel process of where an organization is at in its own general development to be getting to a place that the organization has evolved to be ready to be intentionally thinking about its race equity journey. And so, going back into something that you were saying earlier, Jackie, that you were looking for things and you had found ProInspire and you had found the Race Equity Cycle Pulse Check and Awake to Work. Can you tell us more about how you were doing your search for tools? And then when you got to the Pulse Check, and this is for everybody, can you talk specifically about how the Pulse Check has helped your organization actualize or make real its equity commitment?
Yeah, that's a great lead in to, we actually were doing this work before the Pulse Check became available. So we felt like we were so in sync with, at the time that we were doing research, the Casey Foundation. What I looked for was documents that had frameworks that can help us lean into like a race equity theory of change. I did some work with the Aspen Institute on their framework. Casey Foundation was a structured document that really looked at the step-by-steps that were needed to start moving your org forward. ProInspire, when I came into their work, I really liked the self-exploration, the identity, the tools that made it practical for folks to work on themselves and really centering people. And then when we got to the equity in the center, a lot of nonprofits in Seattle at the time were really leaning into this framework because it felt like all of a sudden we had language and kind of a map to how to get, like, everybody has to lean in. The board of directors has a lever, the staff have a lever. It was the framework of the equity in the center, Way to Work that really resonated with our team that was looking for an assessment to do this audit. And so at the time, we were looking at a few other organizations who provided similar but a little different frameworks and assessments. We found the Pulse Check, and my staff who worked at the time doing some of the research with Debbie, he pulled us together and we're like, this is the assessment that we want to lean into. This feels like the right tool at the right time. It opened up an opportunity for us to engage not just leadership, but all levels of the org to form a team that would then be our assessment team. And that team included board members as well. And so it was a very synchronistic moment, I think, because we were familiar with Awake to Work and Pulse Check. It was almost like was the thing we were looking for. And during COVID, this is real. We didn't have a lot of resources and it was offered free to organizations. For me, it was a win-win at that moment. It felt like we had some momentum. We were struggling financially, and here was a tool that was going to support us to continue our work forward. So there's also, I've had, a few decades in the nonprofit world. So for me, we were always looking at improving and infusing race equity into systems that weren't necessarily developed to create space for this work and this dialogue that's necessary, right, to do race equity work. It's also a little bit of a, there's some challenges with, I think I had the right staff at the right time as well that were open and willing and trusting. I think I go back to these staff conversations I had, and a lot of what I learned when I first came into this group was we are at very different levels of understanding, very different levels of experience, but we needed something. We needed a tool to ground us in some data that would really help us prioritize what those steps are that we needed to take. And so I can't tell you how thrilled we were when PulseCheck came on the scene when it did, because, we were looking at a lot of consultants and a lot of other organizations, and we didn't have the finances and resources at the time. So that was part of full transparency, how we landed with PulseCheck. But it turned out to be something that really has benefited our staff's growth. We did the PulseCheck back to back at first. Then we took a 2-year pause and then did it in 24. I think we started it in 22 and 23. And then our last one we just finished was 24.
Thank you so much for that history. So Debbie and Fuzi, as people who have participated in the PulseCheck, can you share your experience as well, and how you feel like it's helped the organization?
Absolutely. Go ahead, Fuzi.
Yeah.
No, you go ahead, Debbie.
Absolutely. I just wanted to build a little bit on what Jackie was saying around making that selection. There was another tool we did where we crosswalked all 3 of those tools, and then it led into what do we need to do organizationally to make all of this happen. And I think that also supported this equity framework because it began to let us know organizationally how do we support these changes that are happening. And so to really understand where we are organizationally, it's really wonderful to engage in assessing, reflecting, looking and seeing where we are. I've had the opportunity to be a part of the PulseCheck by going through the questions, looking at what questions look at which segment of the organization, meaning looking at it from an operation lens versus the board lens. And so some of the questions we really lean into the board, and others we really lean into the staff connection and engage those dialogues. With that, we form committees. Now, these committees are really a cross section of the organization, from Jackie being the executive director to folks that are working in direct services within the organization, the administration, and management. So, with that, we formed this committee that engages in these incredible dialogues, perspectives. I didn't know we did this, or yes, we've been engaging in this for several years. Well, have we thought about this? Well, what does that mean? Well, what do these words mean? And so it's incredible to have this cross section of conversation where we would schedule maybe 2 hours. It led to having additional sessions because the conversations are so rich. It's almost as rich as scoring the process. The other thing, after we pull and identify certain questions that would be board engaging, those conversations also went on for hours around, well, what does this mean? What does this really look like organizationally? And then we pull all that data together and begin to score ourselves on the PulseCheck. Here's what's exciting for me. We get back from you all
Mhm.
information that says, this is where we see you based on your responses.
Mhm.
And you have levers. So now it's not like you go do this. Everyone has this lever in the work that we do. And so as we're building out our plans for what is the work that will happen this year, it's really clear to say, are we really meeting based on what we said about ourselves organizationally? Are we doing things to help the organizational move by looking at your own individual lever? I think I got a little excited, so I will step back and hand off to Susie.
At all, Debbie. I think that's great. It's a great segue in terms of after we did find got our levers and where we the data that showed where we are. It was critical for the board at least to take the recommendations and really move forward with that process. So we've out of the recommendations we picked two areas. From the audit and from the levers, and so we prioritize one, personal and interpersonal development of board members, because we recognize that we sit in positions where we're making decisions about the organization. So how do we continue to grow and develop in the racial equity lens? So we've engaged in a group, an IDI, which is an intercultural development inventory, for us to assess where we are, and it's a tool that we used as a result of the equity pulse check. So within that tool, all board members took a test that was a psychometrics test that's through the intercultural development inventory, and we identified how do we deal with content that's culturally different than us. So if we're from a specific culture, how are we interacting with information, with people, with structures that are different than us? So, and it gave us
I think Fuzi might have frozen there for a second.
I do believe so.
Well, I hope we get Fuzi back with us because what he was saying was really, really exciting. Uh, I think though, I've learned so much just listening to all of you talk about your experience, and I think that there's so much that you've shared about how the pulse check has encouraged folks to sort of where they're at in the organization, recognize their responsibility, for advancing race equity and social justice in the organization. And I think that's something that's a great, like, natural, something that we want to see happen. Folks everywhere in the organization recognize that they have a role to play in the organization's commitment. Um, so we hope we get Fuzi back in a second. But in our last few minutes here, I wanted to hear you guys talk about what advice you would give to other folks considering the Race Equity Cycle Pulse Check for their organization's race equity journeys.
I could start out with, as from a leader's perspective, make sure that you set up a system of support for the staff members who are going to lead the process. Very important to set aside time outside of their own day-to-day work. This is a process that does require engagement. It requires preparation. And so we do our best to host these meetings to start looking at the audit, debating the questions before we rate ourselves. So, we like to take care of folks. We like to feed them during those that are participating. We want to make time. If you need to compensate staff at a different level, that it's outside of their regular work hourly schedule, you might have to do that. The executive should be involved in all conversations. Board should be involved in these conversations. I think you need to take time to educate the board on what this is so that they feel successful as they step into a predominantly staff-heavy group that works on the pulse check. The other thing I would say is to be honest. I think it's about continually improving. I don't think we ever will arrive. I think it's a journey, and setting that mindset helps people really point out how they are experiencing something from a different level of the org, not how you want them to experience. So you have to sometimes, the managers, the upper leadership have to let go a little bit and let other staff come in and be honest, because that's the only way we're really going to understand what and how people are experiencing things and help them to move forward. So those are some of, from my lens, what I would recommend folks to consider in leadership. I think I'll pivot to Debbie from a staff perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jackie, because as the leader of the organization, all of those things were set in place for our success. When I think about it from a training lens, it's really looking at, excuse me, I'm so sorry, that culture change, because the organization is a group of people that are setting these things in place. And how do we address ourselves as individuals? And the first thing I think about is understanding the why, and it's so wonderful that we can go back to our founding documents of our vision, our mission. Why does this apply to me? I don't think about those things. I'm not this or I am this. But when we lean into all, we're leaning into, and yet you may not think about this, or yet this may not have implications to you. It does have implications to others. And so if we're going to create a culture of all, then this is a conversation that we all need to have. And the other thing, it's just reinforcing it. So it's not just the words we say. What are the things that are reinforcing us to do this? How are these values played out in the organization? And then we need to look at building the skill set. And building the skill set starts with, can we just even have a dialogue? Is it a safe place to engage in those dialogues? And I'm trying to move away from safe. I know it's more about brave. It's more about, creating that environment that you don't have to agree with the masses, but we do need to engage you right where you are. And then having that movement. And that's what the pulse check does. It shows us that, yes, we may have been at this one stage, but we took a step. That's showing a movement. It's showing a progression to someone, to getting where we want to go. So it really leans into those practical applications. I'm going to pause because I get kind of excited, and Fuzi is back. So really want to bring his voice back in.
Thank you, and I apologize. My something went off from my computer, so I'm back. I was, I think what I was sharing earlier, the two areas, and to not to digress, but I think it was, we took one opportunity to develop as a board, and creating that brave space that Debbie was just talking about was one of them, right? And how do we disagree, but also keep this lens that we, the racial equity lens, and also challenge our conversations and decisions through that lens. And the second part was sustainability. How do we make sure that there will be funding in the future to sustain this work? And that was a commitment that the board had to make, because we know this is an ongoing process, and we wanted to make sure that it has a space in the budget, because it's important work, and we know that it's making sure that we're securing sustainability for this. So those are the two areas that we've worked on as a board to make sure that it's the structure of this is supported, and then work continues to happen.
Thank you so much for bringing those points back in, and welcome back. As we were, just getting out of here, I was asking Jackie and Debbie to share any advice that they have for folks who are considering the Race Equity Cycle Pulse Check for their organizations. And so I'll pose the question to yourself as well, although I think you got to some of it too there, making sure that there's adequate funding and adequate support for the organization to continue to stay involved in, their race equity journey. But sort of if there's anything else you have to say to folks who might be considering this tool.
Yeah, I would say to continue to challenge the status quo and the way we make decisions. I think creating a brave space to have this dialogue, as Debbie was mentioning, is a critical aspect of it. And building a culture around normalizing conflict and really pushing, challenging each other to create the best decisions that make sense for the organization. And so that was something I try to do in the board as a board, and continue to help move this work forward.
Thank you so much for sharing that. So Debbie, Jackie, Fuzi, we are at time, but I wanted to thank you so much for working with us and sharing your experience with the Race Equity Cycle Pulse Check. For everybody who's watching and who will watch the recording, we've shared some links so that you can learn more about ARC, more about their journey with the Race Equity Cycle Pulse Check in a case study on our blog, and then more about the Race Equity Cycle Pulse Check itself on our website. And once again, thank you all so much for taking time to speak with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was our pleasure. Thank you.